Soviet Union. Okay. About 100% of the people here knew the right answer. Nearly half of the American public does not. Which countries took part in the SALT talks, also known as the START talks? United States and the Soviet Union? Well, again, most people seem to be aware of that fact. In this country, over half of the American public does not know, could not identify the countries taking part in those talks. Again, more particularly from our point of view, how many people in this room have heard of the policy, new Soviet policy called glasnost? 100%. Only 1 in 10 Americans has ever heard that term, expresses any familiarity whatever with the term glasnost.
That explains what I
2 lessons, I think, emerge clearly from these data. First, as I said before, the ignorance of the American public on issues of foreign affairs. And second, anything that you or I think we know about public opinion, based on our conversations with our fellows, has got to be deeply suspect, because we are different. The fact that we have this basic information, the way in which we think about foreign affairs, the way in which we think about these issues, makes us fundamentally different from the great majority of American voters. In any event, part of the explanation for the apparently contradictory trends that I discussed before is ignorance and disinterest. People don't have the information, and they don't take the time and effort to reach considered judgments about foreign policy issues. There's a deeper source of ambivalence, and one which is reflected, albeit in a somewhat inchoate way, in the statements that we're hearing from a wide variety of presidential candidates and from others in this year. In the public mind, there are 2 parallel tracks along which attitudes run, attitudes towards foreign policy and human rights run. One revolves around questions of morality, the other around questions of interests. Each of these organizing dimensions manifests itself in a variety of different ways. Some moralists see the Soviet Union as an evil empire, which threatens fundamental Western values and which must be fought at every turn. A very different moralist perspective is evident among what some might call the messianic peace community. Those who see nuclear war as the ultimate immorality, who raise live and let live to the level of first principles, and who see in the primacy of conciliation over conflict a fundamental moral imperative. Let me be clear, I'm not taking a position on any of these particular perspectives, but these are different, very different perspectives, each of which emerges from a fundamental attitude, from a fundamental perspective which says the moral component is primary in foreign policy. The politics of interest also manifests itself in several guises. Kissingerian détente is a prime example of interest-based calculation. Morality plays a distinctly second-level role in that program. And Dr. Kissinger was very upfront about that in discussing his attitudes towards foreign policy. Now, those who assert the need for U.S.-Soviet trade to improve U.S. business climate also fall among those people who stress and argue the primacy of interests. Much of public opinion on foreign policy, much of the political dialogue on the issues which confront us, can be understood as the interplay between these 2 competing organizing principles. Principles that structure one's beliefs, one's attitudes. In the mid-1970s, America was in a preeminent world position. Our economy was sound and prosperous, and the Soviet threat, while present, was seen as relatively minimal. In that period, the politics of morality was ascendant. Jimmy Carter rallied the American public under the banner of human rights, as you will all recall. By the mid-1980s, we'd undergone some profound transformations. The American economic picture is really not as bright as it once appeared. Trade deficits, budget deficits loom large in our thinking. Second, our military allies have become our economic adversaries at a time in which economic strength and economic power seems more important than military power. And third, the Soviet Union seems to be moving away from a rigid ideological stance toward a more cooperative and open posture in the public mind. Now the politics of interest dominates the politics of morality. Those interests continue to be expressed in a variety of different ways, economic, military, etc. But there seems precious little room in the politics of interest for issues of human rights and for concern about Soviet Jews. Our challenge then, in dealing with public opinion and the politicians who tend to reflect it, is to craft a message that allows those who are animated by the politics of interest to accept the moral imperative, and in particular, the moral imperative of human rights and freedom for Soviet Jews. Thank you.
Quite appropriately, our next speaker is Ralph Murphine. Ralph is a principal with the firm of Murphine & Walsh, which, well, is about 5 years old. Ralph has been in the business of general political consulting for over 20 years. Has been a consultant to political parties, interest groups, National Democratic Committee, National Education Association, various of the Latin American Christian Democratic parties. And where Mark Bowman has just concluded telling us what one of the challenges is, Ralph's primary focus is having an effect in delivering once those contacts are made, and how to best employ the interests that we have with the contacts we develop.
She's going to Israel tonight.
Thank you very much. Let me say also thank you to Morris Abrams and Greg Goodman, my good friend Mark, for this opportunity. I am, as you may know, sort of last-minute stand-in for Dick Camber, a fellow consultant who unfortunately could not be here this morning. Dick sends his regards and apologies that he isn't able to be here. He, I think, had some interesting and important things to say, and I'll try to convey those to you along with my own thoughts on this very important public policy question. I do think that it's appropriate that you've scheduled things so that, in fact, I come immediately following Mark's presentation in the normal course of events in a political campaign, and in many ways that's the endeavor in which you're involved. That's the natural sequence of things. Campaigns run, as you may know, on research about public opinion, and then some contact program as a result of that research. Contact aimed at moving people in a particular direction. I think Mark made probably the most crucial point in this sort of effort right at the beginning by saying there is, thank goodness, consensus in American society on this issue. There is not major disagreement. There are so many issues that Mark works with, that I work with, on which there are fundamental, profound, very deep disagreements. Fortunately, we have here an issue on which Americans, in large measure, are entirely agreed. And although Mark was careful to point out the difficulties in dealing with this consensus on values which does exist, I think it's also possible for us to look at those as opportunities. The fact that only 10% of the people in the United States can explain the meaning of the word glasnost, or who have even heard of it, while it certainly doesn't speak well for the impact of network news, the impact of the educational process in the country, it gives those of us who are concerned about this issue an enormous opportunity. An opportunity which I know many of you are here working on taking advantage of. The opportunity is the opportunity to define glasnost in terms that will have impact on public decisions on this issue. The opportunity to make it clear to Americans that the term glasnost, while it may mean openness of a kind, although it does not translate clearly, that openness does not occur unless the door is open in the national will within the Soviet Union, unless the door is open for people to freely leave. This opportunity to take this definition of glasnost and apply it to the remaining 90% of Americans is a wonderful opportunity. The opportunity exists in other terms as well, political terms that Mark mentioned that you're familiar with, that you've discussed over the past period of time. Détente, again in loose translation, a loosening of tensions among people or countries. The opportunity exists again to define détente in such a way that one does not have détente without equally having the release of Soviet Jews. The questions of arms control and disarmament, always on the front page, particularly in recent weeks in the United States. It's always a matter of interest to me that the discussion about the machinery of arms control seems to outweigh the discussion of the human values involved in the release of Soviet Jews. Clearly, I think everyone in the room would agree, I think most Americans agree, there's an important need to control armaments. But to control armaments without de-controlling human passage is a partial kind of disarmament. Equally, there is public debate on the issue of Afghanistan. Again, I think there's widespread public support in the United States for the position that the Soviets should leave Afghanistan and end the war there. Fortunately, there is again the opportunity in discussing this issue publicly to make it clear that the Soviet departure from Afghanistan is intimately connected with human rights questions. And finally, the question of the upcoming summit conference here, and I know you're already at work in detail on questions involving that conference. All of us, again, I think, pray for the success of the conference. Democrats and Republicans alike, I think, wish the President and the Secretary of State well. But I think, again, you have an opportunity, we have an opportunity, to define summit success in terms of the release of Soviet Jews. The message opportunities here from a political perspective are great because the public is as yet not fully educated on this question. In some senses, the first person to bat is going to have enormous impact on public policy. How is this done? In many of the ways that you've already adapted. Mailing to a variety of important targets, presenting the arguments, presenting, as the governor said yesterday, what you expect public officials to actually do. You'll find that if you aren't specific in your instruction, it's going to be very difficult to get people to really stand up and do anything. There are many opportunities with the telephone to identify people who support our position and to recruit them, again, to do something. And finally, there are opportunities in personal contact by setting up the kinds of meetings that I know you hold almost every day with public officials, and also the kinds of public rallies and events, the vigils, the kinds of events that you plan around the summit conference, etc. All of these are powerful ways to communicate the message once you decide upon it, the message of the importance of the release of Soviet Jews. I do want to talk briefly about some of the potential targets, because I sense, only because I had the opportunity to see a little of yesterday's conference and participated only briefly in a variety of discussions about the subject matter, I sense a sort of natural concentration on the elected office holders. An obvious place to go, because those are the people who in fact hold political power in the United States. But I hope that the group won't limit itself to the elected officials, because there are so many other pressure points of vital importance. I know that many of you have reached out beyond the office holders, and I encourage all of you in all of the groups that you represent to do that. Who are these other people, these other pressure points who may be brought into the discussion with good effect on the public office holders? I think there are several sets of people. One obvious group, of course, is the staff. There are key staff members for each public office holder who, if they can be fully educated on the fact that glasnost is not openness unless Soviet Jews are released, that arms control does not bring success unless Soviet Jews are released. That the summit does not produce a good chance for peace unless Soviet Jews are released. If this point can be made repeatedly and effectively to staff members, sometimes, frankly, it has greater impact than if you were able to convince the member of Congress, the representative, the senator, the governor, the mayor, himself or herself. There's a second set of people who have very great impact on public office holders. Again, an obvious group, and I know that many of you are working with them, but I encourage further work, and that is with family members of public office holders. The spouses, the children, the relatives, the uncles, the aunts, the brothers, the sisters. These are people who have influence on office holders, and to leave them off of the contact list is to unduly narrow the field. Another group that I consider in the contact mix, as you're talking about contacts for advocacy, clearly an important group in the future of the country. There are 5,000 or 6,000 delegates to the Democratic and Republican national conventions. I know that you must be planning some sort of contact, some sort of educational and informational program aimed at those 5,000 or 6,000 people, because those are the people who will be deciding the nominees of the respective parties, and surely to have them fully convinced is to be helpful at any rate in getting the party platforms into a more aggressive position in regard to the release of Soviet Jews. I think there's another group, and this is perhaps a little parochial of me, but I'll mention it anyway. Since I happen to be a political consultant, we're a small group. There are perhaps 300 or 400 practicing consultants in the United States. And from time to time, there is at least marginal reference to the fact that we do have some influence on the policies that candidates and campaigns adopt. Truth to tell, I think we have less influence than the press occasionally indicates. I think that's probably a healthy thing. I'm glad to say that. But I do think that practicing political campaign staff, people and consultants are an important source of leverage on this issue. I am not aware that the group has made any overt attempt to educate consultants on this. And I would certainly take the time and effort to do that. 300 or 400 people can't be very much of a challenge, and yet these are people who have their fingers on the pulses of several thousand campaigns each year, both in the United States and overseas. A well-educated consultant on this issue who understands the enormous popular support for it is going to be more convincing in dealing with candidates taking a harder line on this public policy question. Another group, and again I know you're very aware of this and are beginning to work with them, are contributors to campaigns. It goes without saying that campaign contributors have a certain amount of impact on the decisions that are made in campaigns. I think it's an honest and open, desirable impact under the American democratic system, and I would encourage you to reach the contributors. Fortunately, in almost every jurisdiction in the United States, contributor lists are publicly available, so you'll be able to discover with great ease, those of you who haven't yet tried the technique, who's contributing to which candidates. Your ability to educate those contributors to the importance of this issue, to the enormous public support for it, is going to have impact on the candidates that you need to move and on the public office holders that you need to move. And then finally, I would suggest, and I know that you're very active in dealing with the press. I did see a portion of yesterday's program on television last night. I know that you have good press coverage wherever you operate and where you go. But I would encourage an attempt to try to expand that even to the local level. I know it's difficult, time-consuming perhaps, to reach out to weekly newspapers and other small press outlets that don't have enormous national influence. And yet, as a campaign practitioner, I can tell you that some of these small papers, small radio stations, small television stations can have enormous impact on public opinion, enormous ability to move citizens, constituents, and public office holders. So I think to be able to expand that list of contacts is an important expansion. I could go on and on. I have a feeling that I'm really, in some senses, bringing coals to Newcastle. I know that you're a highly organized group, and in many parts of the country have very detailed, very sophisticated organizational structures. I don't want to repeat the things that you are already doing and already know. I do want to conclude with the thought that while there are, as Mark pointed out, certain challenges involved in getting Americans active in this issue that is and getting it from number 11 up to number 4 or number 3 or number 2 on the list of their interests. I believe very firmly what I think you believe, or you wouldn't be here, and that is it's perfectly possible to do that. Americans are compassionate and caring people. Americans, once they can be made to see that this issue is in fact an issue that directly relates to their self-interest, directly relates to the national interest, directly relates to human rights around the world, can be made to become much more active on this. It's hard, it's difficult, it takes time, it takes money, it takes effort, it takes the sort of dedication that you bring to it, the kind of dedication that gets you up at 7 o'clock in the morning to come to a conference like this, to come here on a holiday weekend, to continue to do that sort of work when you go home, when there isn't the enthusiasm of the crowd, so to speak, and when it's one person at one end of the telephone line. I thought that Governor Kane's description yesterday of the impact that it had on him was an absolutely perfect description of the enormous power that you wield. It's the power of personal contact. And although it may be fragile through a telephone line, it has enormous, enormous political clout. Your ability to wield that, I think, is an important indication that the world may be headed for the better, although it sometimes seems like it may not. And I want to conclude by commending you for the tremendous work that you're doing, and thanking you very much for the opportunity to come and to say a few words to you about the importance of this issue today.
The American Jewish Congress. It was in the Soviet Union in 1976. And the most I made before we started this was that Mark was going to talk about political positioning of the NCSJ and the focus of our efforts. My wife is a sex therapist, and when she advertised a couple months ago putting together a seminar in the Washington Jewish Week, a couple friends of mine called me up and said, "Is it true that those who can do and those who can't teach?" As the proud father of two, I guess you can do both. Nice task, thank you. Having just recently left 2027 Massachusetts Avenue, which those of you who know Washington at all and know what we are about as a community, know that that is the home of not only the American Jewish Congress and the American Jewish Committee's offices in Washington, but the Religious Action Center, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, and my suite mates for the last 5 years in the National Conference on Soviet Jewry. What I have missed most about leaving the community, as it were, has been leading 2027 Massachusetts Avenue. And though Frank pointed out the most competent and appreciated staff that exists in New York, I would be remiss if I did not mention, from a personal as well as professional standpoint, the incredible work and the incredible resources that you have, a precious resource, in the Washington office of NCSJ, led by Mark Levin and Robin Safe and Barbara Gaffin. It makes my job, having left that building and left the direct day-to-day involvement professionally in the movement, that much easier when I can call upon my friends. We approach this concept of human dignity and human rights. There doesn't seem to be anyone out there on the campaign stump who feels that the National Conference on Soviet Jewry's approach is incorrect policy. Yet we haven't done a good enough job. Our human rights planks must be raised at every turn, not only during the platform, not only during the campaign, but the other 364 days of the year after the first Tuesday in November. And it cannot be presented as an either-or. Either you get an arms agreement or you fight for human rights. It must be presented as an and. We should also not lose sight of the importance of the Senate and the House races. Not just focus on this presidential campaign. This is where our local communities can be of most benefit, particularly in a presidential election year. All focus is going to be on the top prize, But as we have come to realize over the years, Capitol Hill's politics present us with incredible resources, incredible voices of support, and tremendous opportunities for success. Now, I'm not going to give you my standard stump coalition speech. How to be a friend, to have friends, one must be a friend. I will give it to you in a shorthanded way. If we do not speak out on other groups' agenda, not through the NCSJ, but through our own community political involvement, it's going to be very difficult when we wear our NCSJ Soviet Jewry hat to go to those people and say, come aboard. We need to pick and choose. We can't be everything for everybody. But hopefully when you leave a conference such as this and you wear your other community relations hats and you are involved in other political issues, that you will keep in mind the fact that when you are...
Thank you, Frank and friends. I don't think it can be repeated.
It's okay, I have to sit. I have to sit down
The whole movement is for the support of the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, and the National Security Council. I don't believe that in any administration there has ever been such a united and effective support as we have received from this administration. It has been actually beautiful physical support, but also moral support and emotional support. Whenever these subjects have come up with the chief officers of the state, they have always felt that their heartstrings were involved as well as their heads. I'm delighted today that the view from the White House is going to be presented by a man who has held the office of advisor on national security affairs to the President of the United States, not only since the beginning of this year, but since the beginning of this year. I think the National Conference has had at least 3 or 4 meetings on the subject of Soviet Jewry. And on each occasion, he has been forthcoming, responsive, understanding, and fully cooperative with the program of the redemption of Soviet Jews. Frank Carlucci was sworn in as Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs on January the 2nd, 1987. He's a retired career minister in the United States Foreign Service. He was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and he graduated from Princeton University. He served 2 years as a lieutenant in the Navy aboard the USS Ronbach. Thereafter, he attended the Harvard Graduate School of Business. He joined the Department of State as a career Foreign Service officer in 1956 and has served in a wide area. From 1978 to 1981, he served as Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, before he speaks, I know he would want to listen, as we all do, to the custom of our meetings, and that is to the roll call for refuseniks, Leah Silverstein of Chicago.
In the current political climate, it is necessary to give proper attribution to the words and ideas of others. And so I'm going to begin my presentation by quoting the words of Elie Wiesel. I know I cannot solve all the injustices in the world, but I can protest one injustice. And it is one injustice to one family in the Soviet Union, the Lifshitz family, that I want to bring to your attention today. They are not only Jews, but refuseniks, and special refuseniks at that. For Andrei, 49 years old, and Victoria, 44 years old, have publicly renounced their Soviet citizenship, an act not recognized by the Soviet government, and become citizens of the State of Israel. Not only are they Israeli citizens, but a part of the growing number of Balei Tshuva, or Jews who have begun to observe the mitzvot, the laws of religious observance, including Shabbat and Kashrut. Physically, they are in Moscow, but spiritually and emotionally, they are already in Israel. Behind the closed doors of their apartment, they lead active Jewish lives, for which they are paying a high price. The first time that Andre and Vika applied for permission to leave the Soviet Union was in 1978. Vika was forced to leave her job at that time, and Andre, a scientist, was demoted to the lowest position in the department of which he had been formerly chairman. He was retained at the lowest pay scale because of his exceptional abilities. They are actively involved in the Refusnik community. Just a few months ago, Vika and Andre were critically mentioned by name in a Moscow newspaper article. Andre's picture was seen throughout the Western world in Time magazine protesting the imprisonment of Yosef Begun. When Elie Wiesel was in Moscow last October, it was at the Lifshitz house that he met with Refusniks. Andre actively promotes the religious school for children of Refusniks. This family stands unafraid. Andre Lifshitz, self-taught,